Next up, we have Overcoming Alternative Facts and Fake News, Climate Change, Energy, and Environment. Our panel moderator will be Todd Woody. He's the Executive Director for Environment at News Deeply. Thank you. As our panelists are sitting down, I want to thank our sponsors, Julianne Wrigley's Global Institute of Sustainability at Arizona State University, Turner Foundation, EarthX, Million Acre Pledge, Town of Snowmass Village, and the Grace Richardson Fund. Thank you.
Good morning. Just a little bit about News Deeply. We're a New York-based company that creates single-subject news sites on issues of global significance to do sustained and in-depth coverage. Our environmental sites include Arctic Deeply, Water Deeply. We just launched Oceans Deeply, and on the drawing board is Energy Deeply. Fake news and alternative facts are not a new phenomenon when it comes to climate change in environmental news. For decades, the fossil fuel industry has attempted to undermine the scientific consensus on climate change. What is new, however, is that the leadership of the US government now is a chief source of fake news and alternative facts about climate change and environmental issues. President Trump last week told the mayor of Tangier Island, the Chesapeake Bay, not to worry about sea level rise, even though the island is losing 15 feet of land a year due to sea level rise and erosion. And scientists believe it will be uninhabitable in 50 years if nothing is done. Earlier this month, EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt falsely claimed that 50,000 new coal jobs have been created since December, and that 7,000 were created in May alone. The Bureau of Labor Statistics says only 400 coal jobs were created in May and only 1,300 since December. For some context, as John Oliver pointed out last night, J.C. Penney alone employs more than 100,000 people, and they're failing. Megyn Kelly at NBC News, meanwhile, gave Alex Jones a national platform. In this environment, how do we overcome fake environmental news? Our panel is here to help us answer that question. To my immediate left, Laughlin Artz is Executive Director of 2020 or Bust, an organization that's mobilizing citizens around climate change. Ruarai McKenna is Director of Strategy and Partnerships at Care2, a social network that helps people start petitions to affect change. I'll let them introduce themselves and tell a little bit about their work. Laughlin?
Hi. I got into this whole climate change deal relatively recently, a little over 3 years ago, and I got into it as a journalist, and also I have a long background in activism and social issues, and I just didn't know what the heck was going on. I just didn't know the facts. All I wanted to know was what is actually happening, not the optimism, the pessimism, the mitigation, the progress, anything, just what's actually happening. And specifically, I wanted to know how long we have till the crap hits the fan. And is what we're doing enough? And so I just kind of went on this expedition and ended up at a momentous moment in my life with the Assistant Secretary General at the UN, with climate policy, and he let me know that it's probably already too late. This was 3 years ago. It's probably, in all probability, it's too late. However, if it isn't, we've got 5, 7 years maximum, if it's not already too late. And I was shocked. I was like, oh my God, it's like those science fiction movies where you look around and say, this can't be true, or these people wouldn't be having cocktails. I mean, this is all you'd be talking about. And so I just went out and said, all right, I want to find out if this is actually accurate. And so I started going to the conferences, and the Paris conference, and the Bonn conferences, and NGO conferences, and studies, and everything. And I was simple, because I wasn't anybody. I'm just a guy from Brooklyn, so I'm totally, don't have any axe to grind. I'm not printing it. I'm not on CNN, so people will talk to you, right? Not like this, but they'll talk to you on the train. They'll talk to you at the bar, and I started asking the same question, and every single person that I talked to said, if you're not going to print this, it's probably already too late. And I'm like, well, why don't you tell people? Well, we don't want to alarm them. We don't want to scare them. Listen, if my house is on fire, I'll be alarmed. I'm a big guy, okay? Let me move through it. But don't give me some pablum, make me feel good about it. I don't want a fireman that's going to be optimistic. I want somebody with water. So, including, and as somebody actually mentioned that, when I was at the Paris deal, that China gets up and says we're going to peak emissions by 2030. Well, the research we've done, and we now have a whole team of people, the head authors of the UNEP emissions gap report and everything on the team now, how come nobody got up after him and said, well, that's 10 years too late if you actually want to end this thing in time? Where's that person? And that's the news that we're not getting. So a lot of people talk about fake news like Breitbart and kind of the obvious things that, but kind of in terms of what David Fenton just said, you know, the fake news is CNN, the fake news is the New York Times, the fake news is the Washington Post that are out there like, we're not the fake news. Not necessarily from what they print that's fake, but all of the omission. It's irresponsible, bordering on criminal. And then the other thing about it is that when I was in Marrakesh when Trump got elected, my God, it was, you know, talk about a wake. And it really hit me that people really are, not that they just have an opinion, but we are in a reality that where the power lies is in government. And that's not accurate. Where the power lies is in action. You know, if everybody stopped buying plastic, including the plastic on your table, if everybody stopped buying plastic today, guess what? In a week, they'd stop making plastic. But then everybody's like, well, you can't get individuals to do it. You have to legislate everything. Everything's got to be a law. You have to have punishment, all that stuff. So we live in this kind of environment that the crisis will be ended as a function of legislation or government. And there's nothing legislatorial about the climate. There's nothing Republican or Democratic about it. There's nothing capitalistic or fascist or anything about it. It's simply what are the actions that have to be taken to end the crisis in time? And what can the public be informed of that this is the situation and these are the actions that it can actually take, and that the public is getting none of that, zero zip. That's what I think is the biggest crime, the biggest fake.
There's a lot there. Let me take a step back, and then I want to pick up some of those points, Laughlin. Just 3 or 4 days ago, I was having breakfast with my son. He's 4 years old. And as you can probably tell, I'm an immigrant, originally from Ireland. And this summer, we're taking him back for my sister's wedding. It's a big deal, big plans, get to put him in the cold water. You see a lot of people in films from Irish backgrounds depict it as tough, but the reality is put an Irish man in the water and you'll hear a very high-pitched scream because it's very, very cold. And so you can imagine my reaction as I'm reading the newspaper and there's a headline saying the Moray eel has now been sighted 4 times in the last 2 months off the Irish coast. I don't know if you know what this eel looks like, but it's longer than me, it has a hell of a bite, and it has just destroyed my summer plans for my 4-year-old son. The cost-benefit analysis now of putting them in the water is fundamentally changed. And so the question arises, you know, why is this eel ruining my summer holidays? And the answer very simply is because the water has warmed up. And the water has warmed up because of climate change. Now, I've spent the last 48 hours with friends on Facebook who still live there trying to get more information on this. And these are guys who normally I'm talking to about soccer and about local politics, and they're riveted by this and engaged by this. Now, if I was to ask them, what are your views on climate change and tax credits and denial, or is it real? They wouldn't even think it was a serious question. They think it's like a lead up to, because they just don't engage with this. And on this question of fake news, I think when I read about the eel, it kind of clarified a deeper, more urgent problem. The news that we do read and hear and see about climate change, little as it is, even that is too often about this abstract debate. It's not actually about the physical phenomena of the environment changing and being destroyed and people's habitats changing. And tying this to my own work at CARE 2, just to give you some other examples, some of you may know of CARE 2, and hopefully everybody will by the end of this, but we've 40 million members online, and some gentleman earlier was making a very spirited case against online petitioning and whether it makes any difference or not. Well, you know, excuse me for looking at the evidence, but when you've 40 million people and you've sent hundreds of thousands of new supporters and donors to Sierra Club and WWF and candidates running for office, you realize that you can't afford not to do online organizing these days. I mean, as my old boss used to say, anybody that wants to consider that road is very brave, good luck. But where these two things come together, we have millions of data points that help us understand what engages people and what leads from that engagement to action and what doesn't. And a little bit like me reading about the eel, if we try to start an action based on climate change is this huge, big, abstract transnational, transhistorical, extremely difficult thing to understand and act on. Barely anyone will sign that. If we start an action on the monarch butterfly on behalf of NRDC, potentially going extinct, we'll have 50,000 signatures in 48 hours. If we start an action based on preserving the Arctic Wildlife Reserve, it's off the charts. If we start an action about clean water, about the damage that plastics in the oceans are doing on a whole range of areas, we'll get people elected to office. If upon recruiting those people, they continue that conversation. So where I do agree with what Laughlin was getting at there is how we talk about this is long overdue a reframe. If we make it personal, local, and urgent, people will engage. And in terms of engaging them online, what we found is, having analysed this over the past 6 or 7 years, the average that we're told by our partners, some of the groups that are here today and many others beside, we have over 2,000 organisations, both commercial and non-profit, that we help grow their own communities. They've told us that on average, someone who signs an online action is 9 times more likely to take a secondary action. So I think the greatest threat we have in the climate change issue is not the holdout deniers. It's the people who kind of agree, but haven't actually been invited to do anything with that sentiment. And it's never been easier to find these people, to target them, to find out what local issues in their area are being affected by climate change, and then having initially recruited them to give them a rally to go to, a candidate to vote for, a clean energy product to buy. It's never been easier to do this. But if we have the big highfalutin, the world is going to change, very, very few people can get their head around that or see why it's personally relevant to them. Or if I can make one final extended point, to give a non-climate change example, I was speaking to my friend Rob from Conservative America about this 2 years ago. I used to study persuasion theory. There's fascinating public health study of a campaign to scare people in West Africa into adopting contraceptives. Very scary messaging. Village A, it worked. Village B, it didn't. What's the difference? And the difference was efficacy. Village A, it was easy to actually go and pick up the contraceptives. And in Village B, it wasn't. So people acted on the fear, did something about it, wanted to know what's the remedy. But in the second village, it was too difficult to actually do that, so they blanked it out. They denied it. They started attacking the messenger. For me, that's climate change all over. If we present it as this all-encompassing, overpowering, overwhelming threat, people will shut down because there's no remedy, at least not within their gift. If we instead offer them products that are renewable, energy choices that save them money, not just save the environment, candidates who are not just going to sign massive international Paris-type agreements, but locally clean up the water, they will do those actions. They will take those actions. So I think the fake news issue is less about the Russian factory of paid, let's make it up. I mean, I had hoped that eel story was fake, and unfortunately it was real. The real fake issue is the wrong messaging. And the right messaging is, let's stop having somebody from the Flat Earth Society on debating on behalf of the 3% of the scientists. Let's instead actually cover the physical, natural, real-world processes of what's happening and give people something they can do about that. That will be my take on it.
So what's your strategy to get your message out in an era when people can't even agree on what constitutes reality?
Great question. Our strategy, if I can be very political for a moment, is to say, based on what I was saying about not providing opportunities to act, I think we need to ease off on attacking and vilifying people who are called deniers, because it's much too broad a brush. Very often, these are people who say, in general, yeah, I think the environment's changing, but I'm not about to give up my job in order to potentially help a massive international project. Give me a local, real thing I can do that the cost-benefit analysis works. And so what we do in that type of context is find out what are the 5, 6, 7% of constituents in a local district who actually don't just simply mildly care about climate change, but are willing to change their vote on it. And we'll recruit those people, and we'll then present them to somebody running for office and say, they will go out and canvass for you, or they will go out and canvass against you. But these groups mean it. So instead of it being a blue state or a red state, we're trying to create green states where there are 5, 6, 7% of the people who are sufficiently motivated by local climate change issues that they will either run for office on those or vote for somebody one way or the other based on their position on them. And so instead of trying to have this massive persuasion campaign, let's find the people who care enough about this that they will act, and then give them actions they can take at the local level.
Laughlin?
Yes, I'll pick up the massive part, right? So, and it's really fascinating because, you know, as I said earlier, when I got into this, all I cared about was the end of it. What's the end of it look like? And you didn't hear anybody talking about ending it. And all of the people that I went to initially said, well, you can't talk about this ending it. You can't, because it's too complex. It's just got so many tentacles, and it's political, and it's economic. And, you know, and I'm thinking, well, you know, I'm a simple guy. If my doctor says I'm going to die, but I can't treat you because it's too complex, I don't die. I get a different doctor. So we got some scientists together that were crazy enough, whatever, and they said, okay, we're going to actually put these models. And so they actually came up with the model of this is what the end would look like. And then what could we do in a short term? Because when we look at engagement, it's like if you were going to play soccer, football, basketball, if you didn't know where the end zone was, if you didn't know where the ball was, if you didn't know how much time was on the clock, how much would you want to play? You wouldn't. You just shoot into the dark, right? And so we needed to come up with some parameters. So we actually came up with this game, which is why we called it 2020 or Bust, where we actually have the parameter for what, and it's dramatic, but the carbon reduction that needs to happen by 2020, which enough of the experts say will get us on track. And it's really got to happen. We got like a 3-year window, no kidding. And then we broke it down into individuals and came up with, if we get 500 million people, it's a lot of people, but it's still, there's that many, 500 million people to take very, very simple actions. And if we can set it up in a way that I can see that my reducing my meat today has an impact 3 years from now and getting us on track, all of a sudden becomes a game I can play and one I can win. So then we developed an app. You can go on, you play it. We're gamifying it. We're having it so, because we want to definitely get the kids involved, like the anti-smoking thing. One of the biggest, most effective campaigns in America went after the kids because they can humiliate their parents into stopping smoking, right? They got to come home to them every day. So we're going to do the same thing with recycling, meat, everything else like that. But our thing really was to get it gamified, get it so it's not complex. It doesn't have to be. Yes, it's got a lot of complexity, but I can sit down with somebody in 5 minutes. It becomes very simple. Here's what I can do. Here's what I can play. And I can track my progress in this global 3-year game, the impact that my action is having today on the end of the crisis.
So, Laughlin, you often use humor to engage audiences.
Sure, it's got to be entertaining.
Yeah,
We got to get the Kardashians, not just the people that like the charts and the graphs. We got to get the reality show people, the people that would never come to a climate thing, right? But boy, they'll play Pokemon. They want to win something. They want to get some points. They want to be one of the good guys, not the zombies. Really? We want to win the game. We don't, it doesn't, you know. I tell people there's a lot worse things than dying of climate change. One of them is attending a climate change conference, and I go to a lot of them.
So what doesn't work when trying to overcome so-called alternative facts or fake news?
In the climate change context, obviously, one of the most dangerous things I think we can do, and this is where it gets complicated, is to give air to the debate itself. So there's a whole school of research on the moment you even engage on a crazy question. For a lot of people who are only paying very peripheral attention to the debate, you've at least seeded some of the premises of the other person. Now, my colleagues often would say, so we give no credence nor time to deniers. My comeback to that is, well, look at the Congress and the President and what just happened in Paris. I mean, we're losing this. It doesn't matter if the majority of the population are either on our side or are sympathetic to this position. The way the political structure in this country works means that it's not enough to have the majority, so everybody gets that. So what do we do instead? I think what we do instead, number one, is give Conservatives an opportunity to win on this issue. I'm extremely interested in practical ideas about tax cuts, about opening up energy markets to save people money, about turning the opportunity to save the climate into an opportunity to improve people's individual lives immediately, number one. And what we can do specifically for those groups is recruit hundreds of thousands of people for them to show that it's not just progressives that care about this. There are a whole range of Americans and other people in the Western world as well, and I can only speak about the West because that's where our membership is, who will vote or buy or join or donate based on your position on this. And to give you one example, most of our work is what you would consider progressive, but it was really interesting after Trump when we sent out a message to our whole file essentially saying, this is the beginning, not the end, keeping people spirits high, etc., etc. How many responded? I don't want to overstate it, but there was a significant number who responded who didn't really appreciate that, because they were saying, look, we're here because we believe in climate change. We're here because we believe in protecting animal welfare, protecting animal rights. In other words, this isn't just a progressive issue. And I think very often we all fall into the habit of saying, if only they knew what we know, they would agree with us. And that's nonsense. Instead, we have to find that brilliant anti-littering campaign in Texas. I love that example. What's the matter with Texas? Or sorry, don't mess with Texas. And so the first time you hear it, you're thinking, yeah, like it's the tough macho, kind of right-leaning epitome of a Texan cowboy who might have that type of sentiment. And they themselves, when they see that, they often think, yeah, you know, don't mess with Texas. But it was actually saying, don't put litter on the ground. And so this wildly successful way of trying to frame conversations and arguments and incentives based on the values people already have, instead of saying to them, okay, not only are you wrong on this issue, but morally you're bankrupt and I need you to change not just your opinion, but your entire identity and your community. I mean, it's crazy stuff. So let's try to find out, how do people see themselves? I mean, the Christian church did this in Ireland about 1,500 years ago. If you now look at the Celtic cross, it has the circle because they said, right, we're not going to get them to abandon paganism. So let's just incorporate those values and reframe this new way of thinking so that it kind of meets them where they are. I mean, they had this sussed long before we had these fancy think tanks. And let's do the same thing. Let's, community by community, local group by local group, what are the issues as consumers, as voters, as donors that they care about, and then frame climate change issues there, instead of saying, we need you to fundamentally join the other team. That would be my general strategy.
So Laughlin, you do quite a few person on the street interviews as part of Context News.
Sure.
So have you noticed since the election, does this fake news, alternative facts coming from the administration and its supporters, is it having an impact on the street?
I don't know. I mean, I think, you know, this is just a personal thing, but geez, it just bothers the heck out of me that they'll spend 24 hours on one tweet, right? Like, okay, show the tweet, and then do you have to really dissect it and psychologicalize and everything, you know, I mean, for the next 23 hours and whatever. So I think, you know, again, kind of what you were saying is that we're in a situation, and if the news is not going to serve us, then we've got to find something else. You know, we've got to, it's like, you know, I talked to the lead U.S. delegate for the Paris Accord, and I saw him at the last conference they had in Bonn. And I was telling him about our strategy and our project, and I said, fundamentally, our strategy is we plan on Trump doing exactly what he says he's going to do. And he's going to run as hard as possible, and that's what he's going to do. And our job is to make whatever he does irrelevant. And he said that's the best strategy. And again, I'm not talking against politics, against government. I mean, we have, like, you know, wonderful relationships with Citizens Climate Lobby and people that are doing very, very great work in government. But when you just look at the actuality, right? And again, this is the part that I think all news is letting us down on, or most news is letting us down on, is that they don't give us the bare, raw actuality. You know, they give us whatever it is that they need to give us to tie it up into a nice segment, but they usually close with something like, hey, it's a big challenge, but, you know, we're Americans, so hey, we can do anything. No, don't give me that. You know, let me know I've got this much time. Let me know this is what the gap is. Let me know, unless you get off your butt and do something, this is what's going to happen. That's what serves me. And so, yes, I mean, there's just, the only reason they even talked about the Paris Accord because it was attached to Trump.
So do you find, as David
My thing is, what happens if we keep it? What the public doesn't know is even if every government keeps the agreements, we're still going to blast to 3 times the temperature increase we're currently at. But nobody's telling people that. It's out there in the public like, oh, as long as we keep the Paris Agreement, we're handled. And it's not true.
So do you find, as David Fenton said, is that television news is the main obstacle from the media versus print or online?
Yeah, so I think this is where we need to be very, very careful about definitions. So, in my mind at least, fake news is a very specific thing. It's a concerted attempt by agents of certain actors, whether they be certain states or people aligned with those states, to create total fiction and then put it out there, particularly via online channels. And we saw, without needing to relitigate what happened, how some of that worked recently. What has happened since that is now anytime people find biased news or news that they don't like, or a bit like people reading 1984 and thinking it was an instructor's manual rather than a warning saying, no, you're the fake news, no, you're the fake news. So we need to be very careful not to label things fake unless they are literally kind of Russian created or whatever.
Well, I would say when Scott Pruitt gives false statements at 50,000 coal jobs for crusade, that's, you can, whether fake, it's inaccurate, it's,
well,
it's
but
totally
this is why
misleading.
this is why I think we do need to be careful, because if the bar becomes so low on labeling fake news that anything that's biased or is guilty of an omission, then the power of that accusation gets lost.
Maybe we should call it non-factual news.
Well, whatever we call it, my general take on fake news is I just don't think it's the issue here. I think we would be spending our energy in the wrong place if we go back to this idea that if only they had our facts, they would agree with us. I think the bigger issue is, number one, to your point about TV news, let's have less political commentators and more people who actually know what they're talking about. And that's not to say political commentators don't know about political commentary, but that is a totally different conversation. We should have people who are scientists, who are researchers, who have been personally affected by these natural... So there needs to be a change there, and that's not going to happen. So even though it needs to happen, it's not going to happen because they're having a banner year, and so let's also... So what do we do instead? What we do instead is say, traditional media, it's in the twilight of its time. This is now with us, online. We can connect with precision strikes, with messages that have been very, very carefully measured and calibrated based on an analysis of past behaviour, micro-local communities. The only reason I wasn't here last year was I was in Paris working with WWF on a campaign that was very successful. We'll be working in Mexico with a group down there soon. We don't need any longer to go to the traditional media and ask permission to get on the news. Our partners don't need 4 minutes on Morning Joe where he talks for 3.5 of them. Instead, what we're going to do is directly go to people and not just give them information, but give them opportunities to act. And then from those opportunities to act, encourage them, run for local office, buy local produce, make sure you're reading the labels. And I don't think that's going to solve all the problems, but it's a pretty good place to start.
Well, so how are you reaching? Are you just reaching directly through social media?
Yeah,
Or?
so social media, the app, we're going to put on a huge festival late in the fall. You know, anywhere, anybody with an audience, we're after getting their ear. Because again, we see this crisis as a huge opportunity for people to take their power back. I can impact this. If we get kind of that mindset into kind of the global consciousness with this, then we can take on whatever it is, human trafficking, whatever the issue is. But rather than hoping that we elect the right person or hoping that we did this, it's like, no, this is mine, the whole deal. It's not the good guys against the bad guys, and we can actually impact humanity as a whole.
It seems what you both have in common is about empowering the individual to take direct action themselves.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to end it on an optimistic note, never has there been an issue that was more perfectly teed up for right-wing solutions on left-wing goals. I mean, this is ideal. If I was considering running for office as a centrist or as a centre-right person, I would see, which I'm not because I'm on the left, but if I was, I would see this huge opportunity to say, let's create market incentives, consumer choices, let's create local accountability, let's show that by giving communities a stake in this instead of it being only about bureaucracies and kind of legal settlements, that we can change how people are talking about this. I mean, I think that at the same time as continuing to mobilise people who are on the left, whether it be the centre left or the far left, who demand change, these two things can come together to change the conversation. But I think that it's more about turning off the television and actually doing something, subscribing to organisations, making donations, attending rallies, changing what you buy, reading the labels. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that a family can be talking about around the table instead of listening to what's on the television. Yeah. The real change is going to come from here, I think.
All right, Laughlin, in 25 seconds.
No, I think there's just the opportunity that it's a human issue. It's not left and right. It's not Republican, Democrat. It's like that's. I don't know if it's optimistic or not, but that there's an opportunity to break through all of that crap.
Okay. Well, thank you. Please thank our panel.
Good job.
All right.